Della Voss. 20 years old. Deaf since the scarlet fever took her hearing at 9. It was the 4th winter she'd gone looking for a room, and the 4th winter she was turned away. A landlady slid a folded note across the counter. "Rooms promised," it said. Behind the woman, on the board, the key to that same room hung on its hook. Empty. Della did not argue. She could not. Not the way you'd think. She wrote 2 words on her slate. "Thank you." Then she folded the slate away and walked back out into the cold. Months later, a cattle buyer named Harlan Rusk stood in a lobby packed with 30 travelers. He nodded at the deaf girl behind the desk. He did not lower his voice. "She's stone deaf," he said. "Say what you like in front of her." "She's furniture." 2 offenses. 1 town. Here's what Harlan Rusk did not know. Here's what nobody in that whole county knew. Della could read every word off a man's face from 40 feet across a crowded room without a single sound reaching her ears. And that February, she read something that could ruin the entire valley. If they ever decided what you couldn't do without once asking what you could. This story is for you. Before we go on, do me a small kindness. Subscribe so these stories keep finding you. And down in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every one. Now, let's begin. Larkspur, Wyoming, sat in a fold of the high country where the wind never fully stopped. Winter of 1891. The territory had been a state barely a year, and the town still argued about whether that changed anything. Mostly it hadn't. The main street ran 300 yards, hard-packed and rutted, and at the far end stood the Merrick house, a 2-story hotel with a false front and a porch that groaned in the cold. Della had come back to Larkspur 4 winters before that 4th refusal. She'd been sent away as a girl, after the fever, to an oralist school 2 states east. There they drilled her to read lips and to make sounds with a throat she couldn't hear. She learned the lips, the sounds she mostly left behind. When she came home at 17, the town that had sent her off had learned nothing at all. She was the same girl to them. A problem with a face. So she carried a slate. A flat gray tablet the size of a dinner plate, roped to her wrist with a length of leather cord. A nub of chalk lived in her apron pocket. When people needed to reach her, they were supposed to write. Most didn't. Most just talked louder, as if volume could cross a silence that had no bottom. The first winter she'd gone to the preacher's wife, a boarding room only until spring. The preacher's wife had a kind face and a firm no. No room to spare, she'd said, and Della had watched the words form and known them for a wall. The second winter, the doctor's household. They had space. Everyone knew they had space. The children, you understand, the doctor's wife had said, 1 hand on the door. Della understood. She always understood. That was the trouble. The third winter, the milliner, who kept 2 empty rooms above her shop and rented one every year to a schoolteacher. References, the milliner had said, as if a deaf girl were a risk that a hearing stranger was not. And the 4th winter, the freighter, whose note about the promised room hung behind her while its key hung beside it. "My wife's nerves," he told a neighbor later, and never once said the true thing. 4 households. 4 different excuses. One reason underneath all of them, and everybody knew it, and nobody would say it. They did not want a deaf girl under their roof. They thought she'd be a burden. They thought silence was the same as helplessness. They looked at her and saw everything she couldn't do, and it never once occurred to a single one of them to ask what she could. She did not weep about it. She'd stopped weeping about it around the 2nd winter. 11 years of careful watching had taught her a hard, useful thing. People showed you exactly who they were if you only knew how to look. And Della knew how to look better than anyone alive in that county. It was Amos Merrick who finally gave her a place. Not out of kindness. Amos would have been the first to tell you that. The Merrick house needed a clerk, and no clerk worth his wages would take the pay Amos offered. The evening register. The accounts. The dull, grinding arithmetic of a small hotel, done by lamplight after the day guests had gone up. He'd tried 3 men in 2 years. 1 drank, 1 stole. 1 simply couldn't add. Then his wife, Winifred, mentioned the deaf girl who could cipher. Amos didn't much care that she was deaf. He cared that she'd work cheap and sleep on a cot behind the office, which meant he didn't have to pay a nightman either. He hired her the way you'd buy a tool you weren't sure you needed. Della saw all of that in his face across the counter the day he took her on, plain as print. She took the work anyway. A cot behind an office is still a roof, and a ledger is a thing a person can be good at whether or not the world approves. She was good at it. That surprised him. By the end of her first month, the Merrick house books balanced. They had not balanced in years. Amos would sit with the ledger open under the lamp and run his thumb down the column and find, at the bottom, a number that was simply correct. He didn't say thank you. But he stopped looking at her like a tool and started looking at her like a clerk, which for Amos was a considerable distance to travel. Winifred crossed that distance faster. Winifred had wanted the town to be better than it was for a long time, and here in her own front office was a chance to be better herself. She learned to face Della when she spoke. She learned to write when the light was bad. She kept a second nub of chalk in her own pocket, and once, when a guest was rude, she wrote a small unkind joke on Della's slate about the man's hat, and Della laughed. It was a real laugh, low and unpolished. Winifred decided that day that she liked her. Now, the desk of a hotel is a strange kind of theater. All day long, people come and go across a lobby, and they talk. They talk to the clerk, and to each other, and to themselves, and they believe, most of them, that a deaf woman behind the counter is a kind of empty chair. They forget her the way you forget a lamp, and so they let their faces do things they'd never allow if they thought anyone was reading. Della read. It happened first with a man in a gray coat. He came in off the evening stage with mud to his knees and signed the register in a careful, showy hand. Josiah Kent, he wrote. He asked for a room at the back, away from the street. Ordinary enough. But Della had glanced up from the ledger while he was still at the door, before he reached the desk, when he thought no one was watching him at all. She'd seen him turn to the porter carrying his bag. She'd seen his mouth make a different name entirely. Not Kent. Something with an H. Harmon. Or Harold. And she'd seen the small tightness in his jaw when he'd said it. The tightness of a man who did not want to be found. She wrote on her slate and turned it to Winifred, who was passing behind the desk. The man in the gray coat gave a wrong name, it said. I saw him tell the porter his real one. Winifred read it and laughed. Soft, so the guest wouldn't hear. Lucky guess, she wrote back, teasing, and patted Della's shoulder, and went on about her evening. It was not a lucky guess. But Della only smiled and let it go. She had learned long ago what happened when a deaf woman insisted she knew a thing she had no ordinary way of knowing. People got uneasy. People got suspicious. It was safer, always, to be underestimated. Underestimation was a coat she'd worn 11 years, and it kept the wind off. The slate stayed on the counter that night, and I want you to look at it for a moment, because it matters more than anyone in Larkspur understood. The town had given her that slate, more or less. Handed her the idea of it. So she'd trouble no one, so she could ask for what she needed without making anyone stop and face her and feel the discomfort of her difference. Write it down, girl. And we won't have to bother. That was the spirit of the gift, a thing to keep her quiet, a thing to keep her out of the way. Remember that. Because that same slate is going to hold the truth that saves this valley. But we're not there yet. Emmett Cade came in on a Tuesday to settle a feed bill. He was 26 and looked younger, which was a burden he carried like a saddle that didn't fit. His father had died the spring before and left him a ranch and a mortgage in nearly equal measure. A note held against the land, and a young man that most of the county still thought of as somebody's boy. He'd come to town to pay what the Merrick house was owed for grain his father had bought on account, because Emmett paid his debts even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt, because a man too young for the room has to be twice as clean to be believed. He came to the desk with his hat in his hand. He started to speak, and Della watched his mouth and lifted her slate a little, the way she did. A small motion that told most people all they needed to know. And here is where most people got loud. Here is where a man's face would change, and he'd start talking slow and big, the way you'd talk to a child or a foreigner or a dog. Emmett did not do that. He looked at the slate. He looked at her. Something went over his face, quick. A small recalculation, and then he did the thing that not one soul in that county had done in 4 years. He set his hat on the counter. He reached out, and he picked up the chalk that lay beside the slate, and he wrote. Emmett Cade, he wrote. Here to settle my father's feed account. That was all. Just his name and his business, in a plain, square hand. But Della felt something go through her that she had no good word for. She had handed that slate to 100 people. They talked at the slate. They pointed at the slate. Once a drummer had snatched it and drawn a crude picture, laughing, as if the whole thing were a game for her benefit. Not one of them had simply picked up the chalk and met her where she was. She took the slate back. She wiped his line with the heel of her hand, and she wrote the amount owed and turned it to him. He read it, nodded, and counted out the money on the counter. Then he took the chalk again. That's fair, he wrote. Thank you. 2 words. The same 2 words she'd written to a landlady who lied to her face. But how different they sat, coming toward her instead of away. She almost smiled. She caught it. 11 years of caution held her face still, but she noticed the note in her ledger that night sat a little crooked, because her hand had not been quite steady when she wrote it. Emmett rode out not knowing he'd done anything at all. To him, he'd only been polite. But some doors, once a person walks through them, don't close all the way again. The drummer came a week after that, and this is the part where the town got to see what it had been standing next to all along. He was a loud man selling patent tonics, and the lobby was full. A dozen travelers waiting on the afternoon stage, plus Amos, plus a rancher or 2 by the stove. The drummer wanted his bill adjusted, claimed he'd been charged for a night he didn't stay, and he leaned across the desk to make his case to Della, and got no rise out of her, because she was reading his lips and thinking looks like nothing on a still face. He took the stillness for stupidity. That was the mistake people made. She's simple, he announced to the room, jerking a thumb at her, loud, so everyone would hear. The dummy behind the desk can't even understand me. He turned to Amos. Get me a man who can read a bill, would you? Someone with his wits about him. The lobby went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when it's ashamed, but also curious to see what happens. A few faces looked away. A few looked right at her, waiting to see the deaf girl flush and shrink. Della did not flush. She did not shrink. She opened the register. She turned back 3 pages, calm as a woman turning to a marked place in a book. She found the drummer's account. And she found, in his own scrawled signature, and the dates beside it, the error. He'd counted his own nights wrong. He had, in fact, stayed the very night he was claiming to dispute, and had already been credited for a different night he'd left early, which he'd conveniently forgotten. She'd caught it when she posted it. She always caught it. She turned the register around and set her finger on the line. Then, she wrote on the slate, slow and clear, and turned it so the whole front row could read. You stayed the 9th. You signed for it. You were credited the 11th, which you did not stay. The charge is correct. The chalk squared it off neat at the end. The drummer read it. His mouth opened and shut. He looked at the register, at his own name, at the dates in his own hand, and the color that was supposed to have gone into the deaf girl's face went into his instead. Nobody laughed. That was the strange thing. You'd think a room might laugh at a loud man caught out. But the town did not laugh, because the town was busy feeling something more complicated than humor. They were watching a deaf woman they'd all agreed was a burden do a piece of work faster and cleaner than any of them could have, in public on the very ground where she'd just been called simple. And it unsettled them. It did not warm them. Not yet. It unsettled them. The way it unsettles you to find a thing is the opposite of what you decided it was, and to feel, for just a second, the weight of everything you'd assumed. Amos looked at his clerk with something new in his face. Winifred, by the stairs, pressed her lips together and looked proud enough to burst. And Della closed the register and went back to her columns, because the work didn't do itself, and because letting them look at her too long was a risk she'd never once been able to afford. Emmett Cade started coming twice a week. He always had a reason. The feed account, then a question about a shipment, then a bill he wanted broken into smaller payments he could actually meet. The reasons were real. They were also pretext, and I think some part of him knew it, and I think Della knew it entirely, because reading faces was the one thing in this world she did better than anyone, and Emmett Cade's face, when he came through the door and found her at the desk, did a small glad thing that a man cannot hide from a woman who reads faces for a living. He never rushed her. That was the first gift. The second was the lamp. The office was dim in the evenings, and lips are hard to read in bad light. The third or fourth visit, Emmett noticed her leaning to catch his words in the yellow gloom, and without a word about it, he reached over and turned the lamp on the desk so it threw its light square onto his own mouth. Just turned it, so she could see him better. Then he went on talking about his shipment as if he'd done nothing. He'd done everything. After that, it became a set of small things between them, a private language with no sound in it. When he came in and found her bent over the books, he learned to tap the desk twice, 2 soft knocks she could feel through the wood, so she'd look up and not be startled. He learned to spell her name with his hand when he greeted her, Della, clumsy at first, and then quick, because he'd gone and found somebody who knew the finger alphabet and practiced it in his barn like a fool. And once, on a cold night, he set a cup of coffee at the corner of the register while she worked, not making a thing of it, just left it there, steaming, and went to warm himself by the stove. She drank it. She did not thank him out loud. She wrote, on the slate, "You'll spoil me," and turned it to him, and his ears went red, and that was worth more than any coffee. But this is a story about what she could do, and the doing was sharpening even as the sweetness grew. She read a guest across the lobby one evening, a soft-spoken man asking Amos about the road north, and she saw, in the set of his mouth and the flick of his eyes to the strongbox behind the desk, that the man's true errand was not travel at all. She wrote one line to Amos. "Watch the man asking after the north road. He wants to know when the cash box is thin, not where the road goes." Amos, who'd learned by now not to laugh at her lines, kept the box locked and a man near it, and the soft-spoken guest left in the morning with nothing but a bill paid short. Amos never knew for certain, but he'd started to trust the slate more than he trusted his own ears, and that, too, is a thing to remember. She diffused a quarrel the same way. 2 ranchers by the stove, an old grudge over water rights heating toward blows, and Della caught the words neither of them had said out loud yet, the ones forming behind the ones they spoke. She wrote to Amos, "Quick, the tall one's about to call the other a thief. Move between them now." Amos moved. He set 2 coffees down, and a joke between them, and the moment passed. And nobody but Della ever knew how close the Merrick house had come to a broken chair and a broken nose. The town did not know these things. The town still mostly saw a deaf girl at a desk, but the desk, you understand, saw everything. And then Harlan Rusk came to Larkspur for the season. He came buying beef. A cattle buyer for a big eastern outfit, Continental Draft and Beef Company, come west to purchase the valley's spring herds and ship them east on the new rail spur. He took the best rooms in the Merrick house, front corner, up the stairs, and he made himself a fixture in the lobby, holding court with ranchers, talking prices, buying drinks. He was a big man with an easy laugh and cold eyes, and he treated the whole town like a store he was thinking of buying. He treated Della like a piece of the furniture in that store. It was Rusk who said the word, in the end. A lobby full of travelers, 30 at least, waiting on the stage. He was talking with a companion, some sleek man in a banker's coat, and the companion glanced uneasily at the deaf clerk behind the desk, worried about being overheard. And Rusk laughed and set him at ease with the cruelest kindness in the world. "She's stone deaf," he said, loud, nodding at her the way you'd nod at a coat rack. "Say what you like in front of her. She's furniture." The companion relaxed, and the two of them went on talking, easy now, certain they stood in a private room in the middle of a crowd, because the one person who could hear them, in the only way that mattered, was the one person they'd decided could not. Della, at the desk, did not lift her head. But her eyes came up, and she began to read. Here is the thing they'd handed her, without ever meaning to. By calling her furniture, Harlan Rusk had made himself careless in front of the one set of eyes in the county that missed nothing. He'd built himself a glass room and called it a wall, and over the next 2 days in February, Della Voss stood at her desk and read straight through it. The companion was named Deacon Pryor. She got it off Rusk's mouth the first afternoon, the way he said it. Pryor, with the small deference a man gives a partner he needs. Pryor was a land agent. He worked for a bank, the Territorial Stock and Land Bank, and Della caught the name twice, once off each of them, and she wrote it small in the corner of her slate and wiped it and remembered it. The first day she got the shape of the thing. Cattle, drafts, the bank. Rusk buying herds not with coin but with paper. Sight drafts drawn on Pryor's bank. The kind of paper a rancher takes to the bank to turn into money. She saw the ranchers' names in Rusk's mouth, one after another, men she knew, men who came through the lobby. And she saw the two of them smile at each other in a way that had nothing to do with honest business. The second day, she got the trick. She stood at the desk and posted her accounts and never once looked like she was doing anything but her columns, and 40 feet away. By the front window, in the light, Harlan Rusk laid the whole thing out for Deacon Pryor, as plain as if he'd written it on her slate himself. The ranchers would be paid in sight drafts on the Territorial Stock and Land Bank. Good as gold, Rusk would tell them. Take the herds east, ship the beef, and cash the paper. But the bank, Pryor's bank, would suspend payment the very week the herds left the valley. Suspend. Close its window. And every rancher holding one of those drafts would be holding a worthless page. No cash. And their spring notes coming due, the mortgages on their own land, due the 1st of April, with no beef money to pay them. They'd default. Every one of them. And when they defaulted, Deacon Pryor's bank would foreclose and buy up the deeds to the whole valley for pennies on the dollar, and Rusk and Pryor would carve it between them. Della read every word. She read the dates off Rusk's lips. She read a name she knew. Cade, Rusk said, running down his list to Pryor. The Cade boy. Notes 1150, due the 1st. He turned the cattle away last fall, thinks he's shrewd. He'll take the draft this spring. They all will. And the smile came again, cold as the window glass. $1,150. Due April 1st. Emmett's father's mortgage. Emmett's ranch. Emmett, who turned the lamp to his own face so she could see him speak. Emmett, who'd be handed a worthless piece of paper and lose everything his father left him, along with every other man in the valley, and never see it coming. Because the trap was legal, every piece of it, dressed up in the clothes of ordinary business. Della stood very still behind her desk. Her chalk did not move. Her face did not move. Harlan Rusk glanced her way once, the way you glance at a lamp to see it's still lit, and saw a deaf girl bent over her books and turned back to his partner, entirely satisfied that he stood in an empty room. She let him think it. She had 11 years of practice at letting men think it, but under the counter, out of sight, her hand had found the edge of the slate, and her fingers had curled around it, and she was already beginning to understand what she was going to have to do. Because she knew a thing now that could save the whole valley. And she knew, with the cold certainty of a woman who'd been doubted her entire life, exactly how much a deaf girl's word was worth in a town like Larkspur. Which was nothing. Nothing at all. Unless she could find a way to make them believe it without ever once letting them know how she'd come to know. She looked up from the counter, across the crowded lobby, at the back of Harlan Rusk's head, and past him to the window and the white February light, and she began, very quietly, to think. She waited until the lobby emptied. She always waited. 11 years had taught her that haste is what gets a quiet woman noticed. That night, after Russ climbed the stairs, after the last drummer signed the register and took his candle up, Della sat alone at the desk. The lamp burned low. She took the slate off the counter, the slate the town had given her so she'd trouble no one, and she wiped it clean with her sleeve. Then she wrote. She wrote every word, not the sense of it. The words. Rusk's list. Pryor's name. The bank. The territorial stock and land bank. The site drafts drawn on it. The suspension of payment the week the herds went east. The ranchers holding paper worth nothing. The notes falling due the 1st of April. The foreclosures. $1,150 against the Cade place. She wrote it small and she wrote it plain, and she filled the slate and copied it onto a sheet of the hotel's own paper in her clean clerk's hand, and she dated it. She did not write how she knew. That was the whole of her plan, and she had turned it over for 2 days before she saw it. A deaf girl who says she heard a thing is a liar to a town like this, but a written page, dated, in the ledger, laid before a man who trusts numbers, that is a different thing. She would give them the what. She would never give them the how. Let them think a careless clerk left a letter on the desk. Let them think Rusk talked in his sleep. Let them think anything but the truth, which was that she had read it off 2 faces at 40 feet, across a room full of men who called her furniture. In the morning she found Winifred in the kitchen. Winifred Merrick was kneading bread, her sleeves shoved to the elbow. Della set the paper on the flour-dusted table and stood back. Winifred read it standing up. She read it once, quick, then again, slow, and the color went out of her face the way it goes out of a window at dusk. "Where did you get this?" Winifred said, her mouth working large and careful the way she'd learned to do for Della. Della had planned for that. She took the chalk nub from her apron and wrote on the slate. A page left at the desk. I copied it before the guest came down. It was a lie. It was the first true lie she had told the Merricks, and it cost her something to tell it, because Winifred had been the first person in the county to trust her slate. But she told it. Because the truth had a rope on it, and the rope led back to her, and a leak with a name gets stopped. Winifred did not question it. She wanted it true. She wiped her hands and took the paper straight to Amos, and Della watched them through the office door, watched Amos read it at his desk with his spectacles pushed up, watched his jaw set. Amos Merrick wanted his ledger to balance and his conscience quiet. This paper would not let him have both. She saw him choose. He folded it, and he put it inside the ledger itself, between the February pages, dated where it lay. Then he sent Winifred for the head of the Stockmen's Association. It moved from there without her. That was the point of it. That was the whole design. A thing that moves without you cannot be traced to you. The valley began to stir, quiet as ice cracking under snow. Men came to the Merrick house in 2s and 3s and sat in the office with the door shut. Della kept the desk. She saw their faces when they came out. She could not hear a word said behind that door, but she did not need to. She read them coming and going. She read agreement. She read fear. She read a hard old rancher named Buford tell another man on the porch, cash or gold at shipping. Or the herds don't move. That's the resolution, and it's carried. Cash or gold. They had heard her. They did not know they had heard her, but they had. A telegram came for the association from a correspondent house back east. Della logged it in the book the way she logged everything, and she read the man's face as he read it, and she knew the wire had confirmed it. The bank meant to suspend. The trap was real. And now, the valley knew the trap was real, and the valley had decided not to step in it. Rusk felt it before he understood it. She watched that too. She watched him come down each morning a little tighter. A rancher he expected to fawn gave him a short answer. A deal he thought sealed came unsealed. He stood in the lobby the second week, and she read him say to Pryor, "Low and ugly, somebody's talking. Somebody knows the timing. Nobody knows the timing but you and me." And Pryor said, "Then it's your end that leaked." And Rusk said, "It isn't my end." His eyes went around the lobby then, slow, over the drummers and the stove and the coat rack, over the desk, over the deaf girl bent at her books. They did not stop on her. Not that day, a lamp you don't suspect of listening. But she felt the room tighten around her, and she knew the second half of the trouble was coming, because a cornered man looks everywhere, and eventually he looks at the quiet one. Emmett came that week. Twice, as he'd come to come. The accounts were always the pretext. There were never enough accounts to explain how often Emmett Cade found reason to settle a bill in person. He would turn the lamp to his own face without being asked now, so the light fell on his mouth, and she could take his words. He tapped the desk twice when he wanted her to look up. He had spelled her name once, slow, on the slate, Della, and looked almost frightened when he'd done it, as if he'd said too much. This time he did not tap the desk. He leaned on it, both arms, and his face was heavy. "I've got a worry, and I don't know why I'm bringing it here," he wrote on the slate, because some things he still put in chalk, the private things, as though the desk between them were a confessional. A buyer's in town offering good money for the spring beef. Rusk pays in bank drafts. I need that money. The note comes due April 1st, and I'm short without a sale. He stopped. He turned the slate and wrote more. If that draft's no good, I lose the ranch. My father's ranch. And I keep thinking, why would it be no good? But I can't shake it. Della's hand went cold around her own chalk. She could end it right there. 4 words. The draft is worthless. She could turn the slate and save him a month of dread. She could tell him the whole of it, and he would believe her, because he was the one man in the county who already believed her. And the moment she did, the rope came off her wrist and tied itself to the thing. Emmett would go straight at Rusk. Emmett was young and hot and honest, and he would say, "The deaf girl at the desk told me," because it would not occur to him to hide her. And then Rusk would have the name he was hunting. And the valley's warning would be a liar's rumor by nightfall. So, she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She held. She wrote, "Take no draft. Ask for cash or gold at shipping. Every man is asking it now. You will not be alone." He read it. He frowned. "Why?" he wrote. "Why cash? What do you know?" Their hands were both on the slate. His broad and chapped, hers small and chalk white, on the same black surface, an inch apart, not touching. She looked at that inch. She wanted to close it more than she had wanted anything in a long time. She wrote, "Only what everyone is saying. Ask for gold." It was another lie, and this one cost more than the first. He straightened. Something moved behind his eyes, and it was not gratitude, and she read it, and her stomach dropped. Doubt, the first she'd ever seen him aim at her. He took his hand off the slate. He said something she caught only the end of, and he went out into the cold with his hat pulled low. She had held. And holding had put the first crack in the one thing she had that was hers. The crack widened fast, the way they do. Rusk found the shape of it within days. He could not find the source, so he did what men like him always do. He went to poison the well before anyone could drink from it. She watched him do it in her own lobby, in plain sight, because he still thought the lobby was empty of ears. He stood by the stove with two of the wavering ranchers, the ones not yet decided, and he laughed the loose, easy laugh of a man with nothing to hide, and he said it slow enough that she caught every word off his face. You know where this fairy tale started? The deaf girl at the desk. Merrick's charity case. She makes things up. Can't hear a thing, so she invents what she likes and scribbles it on that slate for attention. Whole valleys spooked over a mute girl's daydream. Think on that before you turn down good money. The men laughed with him. Uneasy, but they laughed, and she stood behind her desk and felt the words land, one by one, on the exact bruise she had carried for 11 years. She makes things up. It was the thing the preacher's wife had believed. The doctor's household. The milliner. The freighter. It was the reason under all 4 refusals, dressed now in Rusk's mouth. The town had always been ready to believe it. He was only handing them the match. She wrote nothing. She could not. To answer him was to claim the knowledge, and to claim it was to prove his point, and to prove her innocence she would have to reveal that, yes, in fact, she read every word off his face, right now, across the room, which no one would believe, and which, if by some miracle they did, would make her a marvel to be gawked at and never trusted with a private word again. She had built her whole life inside a silence men mistook for emptiness. Her only shield was that they thought her harmless. She could not lift the shield to swing it. That was the trap of it, tighter than any Rusk had set for the ranchers. Her strength and her defenselessness were the same thing. Emmett heard the rumor too. She knew the moment he'd heard it. He came the next day, and he did not turn the lamp, and he did not tap twice. He stood back from the desk with his hands at his sides. He wrote on the slate, and his hand was hard on the chalk. They're saying you tell things you can't know. That the whole warning started with you. That you read a man's face across the room. He stopped. He looked at her, and it was the look she had dreaded from the first, the one she had spent 11 years arranging her life to never receive. Della, my worry. The one I told you at this desk. Private, weeks back. Did you know then? Did you already know about the draft when I came to you scared? She could have lied a 3rd time. She was tired of lying. She wrote the truth. Yes, he read it. His face did not go to anger. That would have been easier. It went to something worse. It went hurt. You knew, and you watched me sit here sick over it, and you wrote me a riddle about gold and let me leave not knowing, he wrote, pressing so hard the chalk squealed. You saw all the way through me, weeks ago, and said nothing. She wanted to write. I held to protect the warning. To protect you. To protect all of them. She wanted to write. Your name in Rusk's mouth would have unmade everything. But every line of it led back to the how, back to the reading, back to the rope, and even now, even losing him, the 11 years of caution held her hand still. She trusted her silence more than she trusted any person to keep it. So she wrote only, I could not tell you why. I am sorry. He looked at that a long time. Then he set the chalk down, gentle, which was worse than throwing it. A man wants to be saved by someone who'll look him in the eye and tell him the truth, he wrote. Not managed. Not read like a page. He touched the brim of his hat, out of habit, out of the courtesy that was bone deep in him even now. And he went out into the falling snow, and the storm had come down off the mountains that afternoon, and it took him from her sight in 3 steps. She stood at the window a long while after. The glass was white. She had saved the valley and lost the two things she'd wanted from it: the place that was hers and the person who spoke to her and not at her. She had known the price when she chose. Knowing had not made it light. Spring came anyway. It always does. Shipping day fell on a bright, hard morning at the end of March. The sky scrubbed clean, the passes open, the valley's beef gathered on the flats east of town. The buyers came into Larkspur to settle, and settling was done at the Merrick house, in the lobby, because that was where the register was, and where the association had said it would be done. The room filled. 30 travelers, ranchers, the stove roaring, the same walls that had heard Rusk call her furniture, the same witnesses to every wound. She stood at her desk with the slate roped to her wrist, and she kept the register. And she waited. Rusk came in grand. Pryor with him, thin and neat, a leather case of drafts under his arm. Rusk had his easy smile back on, because he did not yet know. He set his papers on the desk beside her register, close enough that she read the top draft upside down: Territorial Stock and Land Bank, payable on site, and he called the first rancher forward. Old Buford stepped up. But he did not put out his hand for the paper. He put a strongbox on the desk instead, a strongbox of the association's own, and he threw the lid, and it was full of coin. Gold and silver, cold in the lamplight. "We'll not take drafts this year, Mr. Rusk," Buford said, loud, for the room. "The associations voted it. Cash or gold at shipping, or the herds stay on the grass. You want our beef. You pay in coin like an honest man, and we've brought our own scale to weigh yours." The smile stayed on Rusk's face a beat too long. She watched it. She watched the exact moment it stopped being a smile and became a thing he was holding up with muscle. "Now that's no way to do business," he said. "A draft on a chartered bank is as good as—" The door banged open. A rider came through it, in a rush of cold air, mud to the knee, a young man off a hard-run horse. He had a wire in his fist. He found the association men, and he set it to the whole room because he was too winded to be careful. Territorial Stock and Land Bank suspended payment this morning. Closed its doors. Every draft on it's worth the paper and no more. Words coming up the whole line, they were never going to honor $1 of the spring paper. The lobby went still. And then, it went loud. Della watched Pryor. Pryor did not wait. Pryor was a landman, not a fighter, and he saw the whole machine come apart in one sentence, and he took his leather case and he went for the side door fast, head down, and 2 ranchers put out their arms, and he ducked them and got out into the alley, and that was the last Larkspur saw of Deacon Pryor. But Rusk did not run. Rusk was made of harder, worse stuff. He stood at the desk with the room turning against him, and he looked for something to stand on, and the thing he found was the oldest thing in his hand. "You're going to hang a scheme on me on the word of a rumor," he said, loud, turning, playing to the doubters. "Some wire from some clerk back east. Where'd this valley's suspicion even start? I'll tell you where. Right there." And he threw out his arm, and he pointed at Della. The deaf girl. Merrick's mute. She can't hear a church bell in the same room, and you built a panic on what she claims she knows. No one is going to take the word of a deaf woman over mine. He said it to the whole lobby. He said it the way he'd say a thing that had always worked. And Amos Merrick came out from behind the office door. Amos had the ledger in his 2 hands, open. He set it on the desk, hard, so the room heard it land. "Her word," Amos said, and his voice carried, because Amos Merrick was done being quiet, "is written. It's dated. And it's been in my ledger since February, between these 2 pages, in ink, in her own hand, describing your scheme to the day and the dollar, the drafts, the bank, the suspension you just heard confirmed by a boy off a horse who never met her." He put his finger on the page. "You want to call my clerk a liar, Rusk? You'll have to call the calendar one too. She wrote what you'd do 6 weeks before you did it. The room looked at the page. The room looked at Rusk. And the weight in it shifted, all at once, the way a herd turns. Rusk's face went the color of tallow. Then, Emmett Cade stood up. He had been in the room the whole while, at the back, his hat in his hands. He had come to sell his beef and save his ranch. Now he set the hat down on his chair and he came forward through the parting men, and he stood beside the desk, beside her, and he spoke to the whole lobby in a voice that did not shake. "I'll tell you what she is," Emmett said. "This county was saved by the one person in it who could see the whole room. Every one of you talked over her for years like she was part of the furniture. Called her simple. Wouldn't give her a bed for 4 winters, I know. I've lived here, I heard the reasons, and I heard the real reason under them. And the whole time she was the only soul in Larkspur paying close enough attention to catch 2 crooks in the act. You weren't saved in spite of what she is. You were saved because of it." He turned to her. He did not tap the desk. He did not need to. She had not looked away from his mouth. "How did you know, Della?" he said, gently, for her and for the room both. "Tell them. However you knew it, tell them now." And Della Voss took the chalk nub from her apron. She had waited 11 years to write a thing like this. She wrote it large, so the whole room could read it over her shoulder. Then she lifted the slate. The slate they had given her so she would trouble no one, the slate that had carried every truth in this story, and she turned it around, and she held it up to Harlan Rusk's face, close, so he could not look away from it. It said, "I read every word off your mouth. You said I was furniture." Rusk read it. And the last of his color went. He had built the whole thing on the certainty that silence was the same as blindness, that a woman who could not hear could not know, and the woman he'd dismissed was holding the proof of his ruin 6 inches from his eyes, in the very hand he'd said was too simple to matter. He had no answer. There is no answer to that. 2 men took him by the arms, and this time no one made room, and Harlan Rusk went out of the Merrick house lobby, not grand at all. The room was quiet a moment. And in that quiet, Della saw the faces she had been shown for 4 winters. The preacher's wife was there, come in with the crowd, and she was looking at Della, and her mouth was open, and she was remembering the note she'd slid across her counter, rooms promised, with the key hanging on the board behind her. The doctor's wife stood by the stove, the woman who'd said the children, you understand, and she was not saying it now. The milliner, who'd asked for references, the freighter, whose wife's nerves had no room for a deaf girl. 4 households, 4 faces. No one made a speech. No one had to. Each of them looked at the girl they had turned away, and each of them understood, at the same slow moment, exactly what they had refused a bed to. Winifred Merrick was crying without a sound, both hands to her mouth. Amos closed the ledger, gentle, and left his hand flat on the cover a moment, the way a man rests his hand on a Bible. The lobby emptied out over the next hour, into a town that had a great deal to say to itself. Della kept the desk, because there were still herds to weigh, and coin to count, and rooms to let, and the register did not keep itself. Near dusk, when the room had gone quiet again, Emmett Cade came back. He came to the desk. He did not raise his voice. He had never once raised his voice to her, not from the first day he'd walked in and found the clerk was deaf and reached for the slate instead of shouting. He reached for it now. He turned the lamp first. He turned it so the light fell full on his own face, the way he'd learned to do, so she would not miss a word, though he did not mean to speak. Then he took up the chalk, and he bent over the slate a long time, longer than any account had ever taken him, and she watched the top of his head and did not breathe. He turned it around. It said, "I was wrong. You didn't manage me. You protected all of us and paid for it alone. I don't want to be spoken to across a room the rest of my life. I want to be the man you turn the lamp for. Marry me, Della. Answer here. And he set the chalk down in the little groove at the bottom of the slate, and he pushed it across the desk to her, and he waited, with his face in the lamplight where she could read it, and everything in it was open. She picked up the chalk. Her hand was not steady. She wrote one word, and turned it back to him. Yes, 6 months on, it was full autumn again, and the aspens on the flats had gone to gold, and Della Voss kept the front desk of the Merrick house as she always had. But her name in the ledger read differently now. She was Amos Merrick's partner in the house, her name beside his on the deed of the business, because Amos had said a man who wanted his conscience quiet had better start by being fair. And he'd meant it. And she was Emmett Cade's wife, and the Cade note, $1,150, was paid in full and marked so. The deed to the ranch free and clear in a strongbox that owed no bank a dollar. On the wall of the office, behind the desk, hung the slate. Amos had framed it himself. He'd left the last thing on it uncleaned under the glass, though it wasn't the proposal. That one Della had kept private, wiped, and rewritten only in her memory. Under the glass, in her own clean hand, was the line she'd held up to Rusk's face. I read every word. You said I was furniture, given to her to silence her. It had kept a whole county honest. It hung where every guest who signed the register could see it, and most of them asked, and Della was pleased to tell the story, in writing, at her leisure, to anyone who cared to learn how a deaf girl had seen the one thing 30 hearing men had missed. The town had learned some things, and not others. People are like that. One cold afternoon that fall, the preacher's wife came into the lobby. She had a niece coming for the winter, she said, and the parsonage was full, and did the Merrick house perhaps have a room to let? She asked it of Della directly now. That much had changed. She waited, and there was something careful in her face, something that remembered a note slid across a counter 4 winters running. Della took her slate, and she wrote, and she turned it around, and she was kind about it, because she had never in her life been unkind and did not intend to start. I'm so sorry. There's no room to spare. The preacher's wife read it. She colored. And she nodded, slow, because she understood the ledger of it, and she went back out into the cold. There was, as it happened, a room free on the 2nd floor. But some accounts a woman is allowed to balance in her own good time. There was one more entry Della had made, months back, on the day of the shipping. She had taken the register, and she had found the line where Harlan Rusk had signed himself in that first February day, bold and sure, a man who thought the room was empty. And she had drawn one clean line through the name, struck from the register in her own hand. Not erased. Struck, so anyone turning back the pages would see that a man had come here and had thought a quiet woman was nothing and had been wrong and was gone. So there she is. The same woman, in the same town, in 2 pictures. In the first, it's the 4th winter, and she stands at a stranger's counter and takes a written refusal for a room while the empty key hangs on the board, and folds her slate away and says nothing, because a deaf girl's word is worth nothing in Larkspur. In the second, she stands at her own desk, in a house that is half hers, beside a man who turns the lamp so she can see him speak, and on the wall behind her hangs the proof that she was the only one in the whole county who could read every word in the room. They decided what she couldn't do. Not one of them ever thought to ask what she could. If a town ever looked past you and called it kindness, comment your city and tell me they were wrong about you too.